Hello and welcome to this event, Powering Progress, the future of Mito clinical trials in Australia. My name's Sean Murray and I'm the CEO of the Mito Foundation. The Mito Foundation exists to support Australians impacted by mitochondrial disease and to drive research towards effective treatments and hopefully a cure of Mito. We also advocate for systemic change to improve the lives of those people impacted by Mito. We'll start things off by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather. We're here on the lands of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I also take a moment to acknowledge those people impacted by Mito. Mito is a complex disorder and its impacts can be devastating. I know that people impacted by Mito can face many challenges. So I extend my acknowledgement to you and my respect for the journey that you're going through. This is an exciting time in the field of mitochondrial medicine. More so than ever before, there are emerging treatments. There is the promise of treatments for mitochondrial disease, something that's been missing largely to date. That's why the time is right to have a conversation about clinical trials for Mito in Australia. Now, Mito is, as I said, a wicked problem. Mito Foundation is committed to this cause. We are committed to this particular priority around enabling clinical trials for these emerging therapies to happen here in Australia. We have identified this body of work as a priority. We are committed to assigning the resources that we can to it to do everything we can to make this a reality and make this a possibility. Now, many of you might know, if you know me, that this for me is personal. I'm impacted by mitochondrial disease. I carry one of the genetic changes that can cause Mito. My symptoms are mild to date, but I don't know what the future holds for me. I've seen my loved ones, my brother and other people in my immediate family succumb to Mito and others facing a daily battle. And I know that that's also the case for thousands of Australians impacted by Mito. And that's why for me and for us, for our Mito community, this is an exciting time, as I said before. We're really thrilled to have partnered with Research Australia since our existence at Mito Foundation. And together we've undertaken a body of work around what does this whole area around clinical trials for Mito in Australia look like. That's why it's my pleasure to hand over at this stage to Nadia Levin, the CEO and Managing Director of Research Australia.
Thank you so much for that, Sean. Thank you for not only your leadership, but of course that lovely introduction into the rest of today's proceedings. It is indeed a privilege to facilitate today's event, and welcome to all of you online and of course here in the studio. I echo the acknowledgement of country and add my respects to that too. A couple of words from me before we jump into the thick of things, as it were, and some of the questions that were put as to why Research Australia as the national peak body got involved in a project with the Mito Foundation, and for some observations, if you like, or reflections on that. So here goes a couple of those thoughts. Given that Research Australia has visibility of the whole of the research pipeline, so that's from your discovery research all the way through that pipeline to the very reason we all get up and do what we do, which is for the patients at the end of the day, we get to see and interact with researchers located in our universities, in our MRIs, our hospital systems, and of course organisations like Mito. And I'm aware that you're all represented here today in your various roles, and those of you who are joining us online, which are equally as important to address the devastating impact Mito has on our community. And organisations like Mito are not just advocacy organisations set up on behalf of those communities for change, but they're also leading the way in creating that evidence, that informed policy, those programs, those actions and that reform that's needed, such as developing this action plan that we've worked very closely with the Mito Foundation on. And it's been a real privilege, as I mentioned, to be able to work on such an action plan. We pushed for a rare diseases action plan back in 2018 at a pre-election summit at a national level, and there's been considerable progress since then, including mitochondrial donations being enshrined in legislation. So the pace of change can sometimes feel frustrating, but it is organisations and opportunities like this that drive us forward, sometimes slowly, sometimes a lot faster. And Claire, I know we're going to talk about that soon as we move through today. So in our system, those many silos need to be able to work together better, and one of those particular silos is clinical trials, and that's a large focus of today's conversation. And I don't need to tell you all that clinical trials are crucial to addressing the unmet needs of people living with Mito, and we know that there are some key strengths to Australian clinical trials. But we also know that compared to the rest of the world, Australia is not quite where it needs to be, and that's in terms of community access to those clinical trials. We know that there are sort of a range of around 60 Mito treatments currently in development, with some 25 odd therapies in phase 2 and 3 trials, which is very exciting. But we also know that our Australian Mito community only has local access for clinical trials to about 3 of those therapies. So we've got a long way to go. As I mentioned, Australia does have key strengths across our clinical trial system, and we need to be able to leverage those for Mito. We're globally competitive. That's great. We have an active and eager Mito community. Our early diagnosis forms a very strong foundation, and nationally there is government commitment through the Clinical Trials Reform Agenda, including the National One-Stop Shop. But this action plan comes at a critical inflection point. Now is the time to throw everything at it. And this action plan is just that. It is a call to action of incremental staged actions to an ideal vision of no more Mito. You'll hear shortly from Claire Stewart, Mito Foundation's Policy and Advocacy Manager, about details of the plan. But I just wanted to pause and make a reflection on the 3 pillars that underpin this action plan, and they are a trial-ready Mito community, a capable and resourced clinical research teams, and engaged industry and other funders as well. Now, those pillars and enablers and barriers, if you like, aren't necessarily Mito-specific. We see them across other disease areas. But as we were working on this action plan, what we realised was it wasn't quite as clean cut in the Mito research area as it is in other disease areas, and that's partly because the Mito therapeutic area is new, it's emerging, it's small at the moment, and Australia isn't necessarily accessing that global know-how. So it's through the collective efforts of this ecosystem, focusing on these key pillars, that we can and we must achieve a collective vision of Australia as a global leader in clinical trials for Mito. And that means an efficient, an affordable and a sustainable ecosystem that meets the needs of the Mito community, clinicians, researchers, industry and other funders. So we're going to delve into, that was a bit of an overview, and we're going to delve into that as we move through now. And today we're going to hear from 4 incredible speakers with deep knowledge and insight into the world of Mito. We're then going to have a question and answer session with the panel, and I'll introduce them each just before they speak. And we're going to have some, there'll be specific questions that we've already received from some of you, and I know because this is live, there'll be other questions. Of course, we'll endeavour to address them all. For those we don't get to, we still endeavour to address them all, and we'll reach out to you afterwards, particularly if they are very specific and not necessarily for this format, but all questions will be answered. We give you that assurance. So as flagged, today you're going to hear from a range of people, but perhaps none so poignant as someone with lived experience. Lee Caulfield's life has been personally impacted by Mito. In addition to his roles as husband, father, and of course paid employment, Lee is also a valued member of Mito Foundation's Mito Community Advisory Panel, and has some deep insight to share with us today on what it means to live with Mito or with someone with Mito. Lee.
Yep. All right, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Appreciate representing the Mito community here today. So a bit about Tyler, our son. He's a 16-year-old fun-loving kid who is like most teenage boys. He's obsessed with his Xbox. He loves his dogs. He's obsessed with hot and cold chips, any kind of chip that's actually out there. For some reason, he's got a little fetish for horror films at the moment, and like me, he thinks poo and fart jokes are hilarious. So, he's, in terms of his condition, he's legally blind. He's currently lost about 50% of his hearing. He's got some issues with regulating his body temperature. He's got very, very low muscle tone. So he's 16, he only weighs about 28 kilos from his visit we had yesterday. And he's got the ptosis of the eyelids, so the droopy eyelids. And when he was diagnosed, it took probably, I think it was around 6 months really to get, for us as a family and parents of someone with Mito, to get our heads around what was going on, what the issues were, what Mito was, because he started to have some symptoms, and then we had the tests and everything done, and we found out he had Mito, and we had to then research into that and what it is, and then that's where the Mito community, the Mito Foundation stepped in and really helped us out to truly understand what it is. And probably it took about 12 to 18 months from there to then build his medical support team. And that ranged from paediatricians, metabolic, ophthalmology, dietitians, neurodevelopment, cardiac, dental, physio, and the list goes on. So that was something that it took a long time to really get the people we knew and trusted. And we had a really good paediatrician who then just last year decided to retire. It was very, very unfortunate for us. And then trying to find a new paediatrician who was didn't have a 12-month waiting list or a waiting list at all. Some people just weren't taking on new patients. So it was a real struggle for us and caused us, myself and Laura, my wife, a lot of stress at that point in time. In relation to supporting Tyler, there's it's one of the biggest frustrations for us as a family and as parents. There's so much, it's so limited on what we can actually do to help him. And we do everything we can, don't get me wrong, but we try the vitamins, the supplements from the dietitians, and they don't really work, doesn't have little to no impact. Do physio once a week, which he actually loves. They've got a little service dog, so he loves dogs, so that's really handy. The school's modified his school program, so they've adjusted his timetable. They've made all the classes really close together because the school's on a real steep hill and there's lots of stairs. So to help him out, they've put all the classes together, which has been fantastic. And then the teachers and his teachers' aides are really supportive. We've got a team for the Bloody Long Walk, about 36 in our team, and 20 of those are his teachers and teachers' aides, which has been really fantastic and showing some really good support there. And in terms of the home, we've done a few modifications at home. We've changed over the light switches throughout the whole house, and that's made a really big difference for Tyler. We've got the backlit LED light switches, so he can now, when the lights are off, he can actually see where the light switches are and walk towards it. We've just got to make sure the path is clear. We've done better lighting around the house as well. So there's no, anywhere where there's steps, we've put the stair nosing on, made him highlight the steps so he doesn't trip over. There's a few other things like handrails throughout the house and in the bathroom in particular, non-slip mats, and then just furniture colours. We're going to be an extra consideration into what kind of furniture, what colour furniture we choose. So it's got a clear differentiation in colour, a contrast, so he can actually see where he can see. He can actually not walk into it and things like that, because that's been a bit of an issue. At one stage we had matching sort of carpet and couches, and he was walking into them, which wasn't great. The one thing we can't change is the colour of our dog, because he blends in with the carpet as well. So we have to make sure he's out the way when he's walking around. So that's just another challenge we face. In terms of trials, we do hear about trials that are coming up. We've heard about a few in Australia, and we do, get your hopes up a little bit, and then only to find out that Tyler's not actually eligible because of his age, because he's only 16, and all the trials we know of have been 18 plus. So that's been, you get a bit disheartened there, and we have known about the ones overseas, and we hear about ones overseas which are great. However, we have to wait a minimum of 5 years before the trial's finished, and then from there we have to wait probably another couple of years then before it's actually available to us as an option. So that's something that, it would be absolutely amazing if there was trials here in Australia, and we know there's one in Canada at the moment, which is about useful, probably would have been useful for Tyler. We're not 100% sure, but it would have been useful for Tyler and others in his position. It's an early stage clinical trial that, if found to be effective, may progress to a larger study, a phase 3 clinical trial. But as parents, we do know that there's no guarantees with trials with these, and however, it would be absolutely amazing for us to just have that as an option in our own country and our own city, to be able to consider it or participate in it. It would just be one of those things that would be a bit of a game changer for us, because at the end of the day, Mito is really unpredictable, and the reality is we don't know what the outcome for Tyler is going to be. So anything we can do and give him to have any possible chance of reducing the effects of Mito or potentially prolonging his life, that would go a massive way for us as a family and a family unit. And obviously that's why we're here today, to talk about the future of clinical trials in Australia. So when I got asked to put my hand up to see if I can help out and say something, I was always going to say yes. So thank you very much.
Lee, incredibly heartwarming and a bit of a mixed bag. Incredible that you maintain your humour. The description that you give of Tyler, he sounds like a completely normal 16-year-old, and credit to you for enabling as normal a life as possible, despite living with such a difficult disease. The one thing that listening to you speak, I think about policy and impatience, and when they meet, we get action. And that's what this is about. This is where we're at today, and through the efforts of yourself and others, that we can make those changes that we absolutely need, and being courageous to share what is no doubt has been a very difficult journey, but it's only through sharing that for people to get a real appreciation of what it means to live with such a devastating disease on a day-to-day basis. Things to consider like furnishings. The one suggestion I would like to throw into the mix, though, is a bell for the dog.
Yes. There's 2 dogs. We've got a white one now, so she's easy to see.
And thank you for the good humour with which you engage with us. We're going to talk a little bit more in the Q&A session, but to move us along to hear a perspective from a clinician in the space, we're going to hear from Dr. Isabel Lopez Sanchez, who is a principal investigator at the Centre for Eye Research Australia, who's working on mitochondrial diseases, and she's also the research manager at Mito Foundation. So eminently qualified. Isabel, we're in your hands.
I'm Dr. Isabel Lopez Sanchez, and I'm here to talk about mitochondrial disease and clinical trials from a global and Australian perspective. So what is a clinical trial? A clinical trial is a research study that aims to test a new medical intervention or treatment. Clinical trials are essential studies because they treat these new treatments or interventions in people for the first time. Clinical trials are a natural progression from the early stages of research, which often involves cells and animal models in a lab environment. Before a clinical trial can take place, research into medical treatments takes many years and involves scientists conducting extensive research and testing to understand how this new potential treatment works, and especially to ensure that it is safe. After years of preclinical research, trials can move into the real world and be tested in people. First, this happens in healthy volunteers, and then in people affected by specific diseases or medical conditions. And the overall goal is to determine whether a treatment is safe and effective. Now, clinical trials are long-term studies that take place in several stages called phases. And there are 4 main phases in a clinical trial. Each phase looks at a different aspect of a new treatment. For example, whether a treatment is safe, whether there are any side effects, how well it works, and its safety over time. Positive results at each stage are needed to move the treatment closer to the treatment being available in the clinic. But it is a lengthy process that takes many years. It's important to note that not all clinical trials make it through every phase, and a clinical trial can be terminated at any stage for several reasons. Some of these reasons include safety concerns about the treatment, challenges recruiting enough participants in a study, or even financial challenges faced by the sponsor or the person or industry company supporting the study. But we know that for mitochondrial diseases, clinical trials are essential. They offer a critical pathway to develop treatments that can potentially change lives. We know that for most forms of mitochondrial disease, there are not yet cures and very few effective treatments. So clinical trials are essential to develop these new emerging treatments. We know that for many Mito community members, participating in a clinical trial remains the only opportunity they have to access emerging treatments. So in 2024, in preparation to the clinical trials action plan we're launching today, we reviewed all ongoing clinical trials for mitochondrial disease through a process called horizon scanning. Horizon scanning is a process used to systematically identify, track, and prioritize emerging treatments for a specific condition, in this case, mito or mitochondrial disease. Our horizon scan identified 62 treatments under development, with 25 of these treatments undergoing clinical testing across 37 clinical trials. Treatments included a variety of interventions or type of treatments, primarily small molecules or what we know as drugs, but also some new and emerging forms of treatment such as gene therapy and cell-based therapies such as stem cell and mitochondrial transplantation. Since we completed the scan last year, new clinical trials have been announced, highlighting how quickly evolving this field is and how quickly the field is changing in recent years. So our Horizon scan provided a really good overview of the mito clinical therapeutic landscape. It revealed that the top countries for mito clinical trials are the USA with 20 clinical trials, followed by the UK with 13 clinical trials, and then Germany, Italy, and Spain with 10 clinical trials each. When we look at Australia's participation, we found that there have been 4 mito clinical trials in Australia for 3 treatments. And these clinical trials took place in Melbourne, Sydney, and Adelaide. What our Horizon scan revealed is exciting progress globally, especially in recent years. However, we know that Australians still face limited access to these trials compared to similar countries. It was exciting to see that in the last 5 years, there have been 20 mito clinical trials, and this is much more than we've seen in years before. So we believe that it is an ideal time to launch our clinical trials action plan to ensure that Australians living with mitochondrial disease don't miss out on these exciting emerging opportunities. When we look at the future of mitochondrial disease therapeutic development, we see excitement developments. And mito-clinical trials are happening now. We saw that with our Horizon scan. Australia has the potential to play a critical role, but it risks being left behind. We believe that new therapies will transform the quality of life of people affected by mito. And we're excited about the range of treatments that are being tested, from small molecules to newer forms of treatment, such as gene therapy and cell-based therapies, that we believe offer real hope for people living with mitochondrial disease. Mito Foundation is working to position Australia as a central hub for mito clinical trials, and this is part of the work we're launching today during a clinical trials action plan. The future is promising and exciting, but collaboration and action are key now. Thank you.
Isabel, thank you so much for that. And clearly a lot of clinical trial activity, and that leads to what we all need the most, which is hope. And that certainly gives us hope that there is that activity and those treatment options. To delve a little bit further into treatment options from deep inside the sort of the research world and things that take place, one of our I like to see them as the engine room of research within health services, and they're a special breed. Of course, I'm talking about a clinician researcher, and Dr. Drago Bratkovic is not only a clinician researcher, but he's also head of the metabolic unit at the Women and Children's Hospital in Adelaide. And now in this role, he provides healthcare for many members of the Mito community, as well as others with inborn errors of metabolism. And Drago's going to share a clinician's perspective on clinical trials for Mito. We're in your hands.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and thank you to the Mito Foundation for asking me to come along and talk to you about clinical trials in Mito. I'm kind of drawing on my experience of doing clinical trials for the last 15 years and also trying to hopefully reflect on how that would impact clinical trials for Mito and trying to bring them more to the patients in Australia. Thought I might start off with a really basic definition of a clinical trial, and I think the most important thing to be aware of as patients and potential subjects in trials is you do volunteer, and you're volunteering to try out new treatments and interventions, and it's really to help see if we can prevent, detect or treat kind of various conditions. But I might reflect here at this point to make sure that you're aware that being a part of a clinical trial doesn't mean you're guaranteed a benefit from the clinical trial. The trial is there to see whether there will be a benefit for people with your condition. There's no guarantee, and that's really important to remember as we go through and talk about clinical trials. This is a little schematic of what drug discovery looks like. Hopefully you can see that on the screen. It might be a little bit small, but what I'm trying to show here is that drug discovery takes a long time, and it's already been alluded to that it's pretty much a decade almost from start to finish, from people coming up with an idea for a treatment and looking at drug options, and then finally having a compound at the end that you can sell and give to patients to make a difference to their lives. When we're talking about clinical trials, we're talking about that little bottom part of that funnel there that you can see there. And so we're talking about what we call phase 1, 2 and 3 trials, and I'll go through those briefly in a second. This slide essentially shows what the previous slide did, and that we're talking about around about 10 years. And if you look at the number at the top there, they're saying around about 2 billion to go from hypothesis through to final drug being marketed. That slide was from 2010, so you could probably add another kind of 20, 30% on top of that quite easily in terms of what it looks like to cost. So when you hear about venture capitalists getting 10, 20 million, it's only really a drop in the ocean compared to what the total actual cost of developing these drugs is going to be. So you'll probably hear a lot about the different phases of clinical trials, and I might just go through this very briefly. So phase 1, these are the clinical trials when the drug has been kind of shown to be safe in usually animal models before this. Then they go to using the drug in humans, and so, or whatever therapy that might be. And for a phase 1 study, we do it just in healthy individuals. So we just usually, funnily, it's usually university students, that they then take a small number of people, healthy individuals, try the drug, and the main job of that study is to look at safety. Is it safe? Does it cause any major side effects? If they get through that and there are no major problems, remembering at each stage of this, things can happen, and then that actual therapy doesn't go any further forward. Then you've got phase 2 studies, and phase 2 studies are where they take the drug and give it to patients with the disease. The primary purpose of a phase 2 study is really about safety, just like it is in phase 1. But because they're doing it in patients with the disease, they can actually start to get an idea of whether that therapy does actually work. Does it do the job that they're hoping it will do? So phase 2 about safety, but from the phase 2 study, they usually get a signal as to whether or not that therapy works and whether they should go on to what we call a phase 3 study. So phase 3 studies are generally the kind of really most important part of the whole process. This is the study that's going to show, does it work? And does it work well enough for us to be able to get it approved for use in people. So phase 3 studies are probably where we're looking at for Mito, and there are probably some phase 2 studies around, but it's really the phase 3 studies that are the most important, and we're trying to get some more activity in that space here in Australia. So in terms of clinical trials, there's probably 2 major types that I look, just when reflecting over my years. There are the clinician-initiated studies, and this is what has been traditionally been the case in Mito up until now, at least in the last 5 years. And usually run by one clinician from a clinical team, usually at a single site, and they're usually funded locally from research grants or other sources. And what these have tended to be, at least in the Mito field, have been repurposed drugs. They're repurposed drugs because they've already been through phase 1 and 2 and 3 for other diseases, and they've been shown to be safe, so you can actually give them to people. But by repurposing them, you can then, what that means is that they're cheap and easy to obtain, and like I said, where the safety's already been established. And for Mito, we've had lots and lots of trials with coenzyme Q10, creatine and taurine now. So these are just examples of some of the things that have been used, that have been repurposed. And like I said, it's been the predominant form of study, clinical trial form to date. The next big type is really the ones that we want to talk about today, which is the company-sponsored studies. Now these are much bigger, and as I alluded to in the previous slides, $2-3 billion worth of development to get them to these points. So these are all new drugs and therapeutics, and they've already gone through a very costly drug development process, and this is really the final test of these drugs to get them approved. These trials are really fully funded by the company. The company pays for everything. All costs are covered. And the thing is, that means they're very expensive to run. And so companies usually have to be very, very certain that that drug and therapeutic is going to work before they go into these phase 3 or 2 studies. These studies, particularly in the rare disease field, which Mito is part of, are generally multi-centred international studies because you just don't have the numbers in one country or even one state to be able to run these studies properly. And so what I'm trying to give you an idea is that any new significant clinical trials for Mito will be of this type, and we've already seen those coming through, and there've already been a couple that have been run in Australia. So with the clinical trial, and when there's company-sponsored trial, I might take you through a little bit of the background about how they develop these studies and what they're trying to prove. So with a clinical trial, a sponsored study, there's usually a primary outcome, and it's generally just one primary outcome that needs to be met for the therapeutic to be approved. So what the companies will do, they'll go to what we call the regulatory agencies. So in America, it's the FDA. In Australia, it's the TGA. Most companies will go straight to the FDA and talk to the FDA and say, we've got a drug that will treat X. These are the outcomes that we want to show to prove it, and they'll have it back and forth with the FDA about whether or not that's an appropriate outcome, and they'll decide that if you meet that outcome, we will approve that drug. Now the problem is what that primary outcome needs to be is something that's measurable and actually reflective of clinical improvement in the disease. The problem we have with Mito is that we don't have what we call good biomarkers. So biomarkers are something it's easy to test, a blood test or something similar to tell you how badly someone is affected with the condition. So with things like Mito and some of the diseases I've looked after and managed with clinical trials, we look for what we call functional outcomes. So in diseases I've looked after, so for example, Pompe disease, it's been muscle strength, or other things like 6-minute walk test that can be measured time and time again and that are reproducible. So it's because of the need for these functional outcomes is that why a lot of the Mito studies so far have really focused on things like muscle disease, which is easy to measure and show benefit. And in fact, even the new studies that are coming through are really focusing on muscle disease primarily and trying to show benefit in that space. So it might take some time to go through who are the main players in a sponsored clinical trial, and just so to give you an idea of that, how complex the whole structure and framework is around clinical trials. So first person, people that you need to be aware of is the sponsor. I've already mentioned them. That's a company that has come up with the idea that's funding the therapy. So they're the people that own the drug. So then we've got, so the sponsor, what they'll do is they'll actually get a group called a contract research organisation called a CRO. Now CRO is actually an intermediary between the company and the clinical trial team, and that keeps, it's actually important that we have this structure, so it keeps the sponsor at arm's length away from what's actually happening in the trial, so they can't influence the trial. And so the CRO will have a monitor, which is someone who comes to visit the sites, who looks over what we are doing as a clinical trial team to make sure that we're running the trial properly and data's being collected and stored correctly. Then you've got the clinical trial team, and I'll focus a little bit more on them. So these are the people that actually run the study. So we're talking about the doctors, nurses, clinical trial coordinators. It's a big team, a big team of people that need to come together to make a clinical trial happen at a particular site. The most important, people usually say the most important, but one of the more important people is the principal investigator. That's the person who takes responsibility for running of the trial at that site. But what they do is then delegate that to all other activities to other people. The most important person is really the study coordinator, I'll be honest with you, and that's usually a nurse or a researcher who coordinates the study. They work out, they contact patients, they book visits, they run each of the visits, collect the bloods, make sure they're sent off. There's so much that they do. And the more complex the study, the more coordinators or people will be involved in running that study. And if you're a part of a study, your study coordinator is the person you have the most contact with throughout the study. They're a really integral part, and certainly I couldn't run any of the clinical trials that we've been involved with without the fantastic team of study coordinators that we've had. I might make a quick mention to the Human Research Ethics Committee, mainly because from the patient's perspective, these are really important people in terms of safety. So these are the people that approve the clinical trial protocol, and when they look at the protocol, they look at it in terms of safety and making sure that your patient, the subjects, are protected all the way through that process. All trials in Australia need to be approved through a HREC to be able to be undertaken. So in terms of clinical trial teams, not all clinical trial teams are the same, and there are a couple of different types, and these are the ones that I've had experience with over the years. There are a group of clinical trial teams called dedicated trial companies. These are companies that really make the business of actually running clinical trials. These are very much commercial operations. They tend to do very large studies with hundreds to thousands of subjects, but they're not really well designed for complex protocols and small numbers of subjects, such as what we see with Mito studies. And they might even really specialise in a particular condition like hypertension or diabetes. They generally do what we call phase 1 studies, where they get all those university students I was mentioning before and try their drugs out with them. A good example is a company called CMAX in Adelaide, who we've had interfaces with, and they run these studies over and over again. They're very, very good at it. But for Mito, it doesn't quite fit because the Mito studies are more complex and patient numbers are much smaller. So this is where we come to the clinical trial teams that are usually based upon in hospitals and part of a specialist team, such as a neurology clinic or a metabolic clinic or something like that. Now, they kind of come in two flavours, these clinical trial units in teams. They've got those that are established and have been doing trials for a long time, and you get those that are just starting up to run a particular study because that's what they want to do. This is where I want to emphasise the fact that starting out from scratch is really, really difficult. You need to find and hire really experienced staff, clinical trial staff, to do the study for you, and sometimes you have to pinch them from other clinical trial teams, which is not very good. But also, there's a money kind of component to this as well, in that starting up from scratch, you don't have any money in your kitty to start off with, and the money doesn't start coming through to hire and pay for your staff until the contract's signed and patients are recruited. So starting up a site from scratch for a clinical trial is very difficult. Instead, there are a lot of other what we call established teams, and they're the teams that I've worked with over the years and have been a fantastic group to work with and have been amazing at getting studies up and running quickly. Because they are experienced, and because they've already got people on the ground, it's much quicker to get the study up and running. One other advantage of an established team is that they're more attractive to sponsors. So when a sponsor is looking at a country or a city to start a trial, they look at the team. What studies have they done in the past? How quickly can they get you through ethics? How quickly can they get the study up and running? How good they are recruiting? And if you've got a track record of doing that, it makes it a lot more attractive for those sponsors then to come to your site and go, would you like to run our study for us? I might just now skip ahead. I had a couple of slides there to take you through what a study looks like, but I thought I'd just skip ahead to the very, very end. So if you're a part of a clinical trial and the clinical trial has run through, what sponsors will do, generally speaking, this is an important question I always get people to ask, is they'll offer what we call an extension protocol after the study. So what that allows you to do is keep using the study drug after the study has been completed. Now, allows the company to get all their data together and then put it and submit it to get approval, but allows them time to do that and allows you as a subject to stay on therapy for that time. This is where I talk about how long it takes after a study's finished. So even though you might have finished in the study might still be running for another year, and then after that, once they've got all the results together, it might be another year before they actually collate all that data, get it analysed and release it. Now, this is where I need to kind of make an important point, and it's happened to me and other trials as well. If the results are unfavourable, sometimes we never see the results. And if you look on clinicaltrials.gov and you look at Mito studies, there are a few Mito studies up there where they've completed, they've analysed the results and there's nothing there, there's no publications, and it's a really disappointing thing. It's something I think that we should change, and it's another kind of thing I'd like to get changed so that even though unfavourable results are published. However, if they do reach their primary endpoint, the company will then apply to the FDA in the US or something similar to get that drug approved. And even that approval process can take up to 12 months. Now, the FDA in the US are extremely thorough, and when the FDA approve a drug, pretty much everyone in the world will take notice of that and say, that's good, we're happy to go with that. And they even visit sites, and we've been in the subject of audits from the FDA in the process of getting drugs approved, and they are very, very thorough. I can attest to that. And this is where I kind of make the other point, is that just because something is approved for use doesn't mean it's funded, and you might not have access to it. So in Australia, TGA do the approvals to say a drug is safe to be used in the country, but then you have to pay for it. Some of these therapies are going to be expensive, and so you won't be able to pay for it out of your pocket, and certainly your local hospital won't be able to pay for it, so it's usually funded by the federal government. This is where I bring in the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, PBAC, as people call it. So that all they'll do is look at the cost of the drug versus the benefit and decide if the government's going to fund it or not. This, again, on top of the approval process and everything else, can take at least a year or so. It's a long, expensive process, and the companies pay for all this as they push it through. And sometimes it can take repeated applications before funding is finally approved for a particular drug. And my personal experience with a couple of diseases and a couple of therapies is that it can take up to 5 to 10 years sometimes, and then repeated applications for it to be approved. I might just summarise there. I know I've gone through a lot already. Hopefully it's given you an idea of what clinical trials are like, the different types of clinical trials and some of the teams involved and people involved in making clinical trial happen. Hopefully you've got an idea that new drug and therapeutic development is a long and expensive process and can take up to a decade. Now, the clinical trial process is very highly regulated. I haven't really touched on that very much, but managed. But the core of it is patient safety, and that's something that's really emphasised to us when we run clinical trials. Your safety is the most important thing when we run a trial. We've had a lot of success running clinical trials with other metabolic diseases, and we've faced the same challenges that Mito has, small patient numbers, no biomarkers, but we've managed to get these clinical trials done, therapies approved, marketed, and people now have access to them. And I haven't gone showing you any slides on this, but unfortunately the current success rate for clinical trials in Mito remains actually quite low. But we hope that that's going to change as new therapies come through and new ways of thinking about treating Mito are actioned. Success in attracting clinical trials comes from, I believe, personally, having pre-established clinical trial teams versus trying to start up a team from scratch, which is what has happened in the past. And it is very inefficient, and it's not a good way of getting trials into your country or into your hospital. And this is my personal reflection, and something I'm trying to get happen, is that we should, as a community, identify clinical trial teams in Australia that I call a Mito ready, to make it easy for companies who wish to run a study in Australia to come here, know who to go to, know who to speak to, and be confident that they'll have a clinical trial team ready to go to run their study for them as quickly and efficiently as possible. I'll stop there, but thank you very much.
Drago, thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, it's clear that clinical trials are complex, they're expensive, there's so many variables, but they are the pathway to hope and to opportunity for those living with any disease, but as we're talking about today, particularly with Mito, because we know that there's a pathway. It's just how do we get on it as the Mito community. We're going to delve a little bit more into what that looks like in the Q&A, so I'll let you off the hook for the moment, but I'm coming back.
I'm expecting it.
But it's exactly that. It is the action that is required to make these changes happen. And Claire Stewart is Mito Foundation's Policy and Advocacy Manager, and you've worked with the Research Australia team on this project. And of course, in your role, Claire, at the Mito Foundation, you look at the work on the mitochondrial donation and of course driving those changes for health and disability care for the Mito community. So we spoke about policy, impatience, it leads to action. What is the pathway? What is the action plan?
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you. What I'm going to attempt to do is explain to you why we did this work, the steps that we actually took to get to this action plan that we're launching today, a little bit of what's in the action plan, but finish with really an invitation for people to join us on this journey. We purposely picked a picture of a road. It's interesting that the road goes around the corner. We're not quite sure where it's going to go. I think that conveys some of the unknown for clinical trials and future treatments for Mito, but we really are inviting you to come on this journey with us. So to start with, why on earth did we want to pause what we were already doing and do this work of figuring out what action was most important? And I think there were 4 reasons, and you've heard a little bit of that already. We think the time was right to take some really specific intentional action. We know generally that Australia is a really great location for clinical trials, but we were starting to see a trend of Australia missing out on some of those phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials. And we really wanted to make sure Australians had the opportunity to be part of the global Mito community's journey towards a cure for Mito, which is really starting to build some momentum, as Isabel talked about earlier. So that was the second reason. I think about the pipeline of Mito therapeutics or Mito treatment options as both fat and long. So Isabel's talked to you a bit about what we found in our structured horizon scan, but it's really interesting with Mito because it's not just going to be one condition or one treatment and one series of clinical trials. We know that we're almost certain there isn't going to be one single therapy that's going to come along and transform mitochondrial disease for everybody impacted. Progress is highly likely to be through multiple trials and each likely targeting different subgroups within what we call the Mito community. And that means that we need to get good at this. And we want to make sure that it's not just about one trial, it's about being good at attracting and supporting multiple trials. And we have intentionally created this plan as a 10-year plan to reflect that. The third reason we wanted to stop and think was that we know this is way bigger than Mito Foundation. Now, you could argue that's true of all sorts of research, but particularly for clinical trials. And as Drago shared, they're very expensive and very complex. The question we asked ourselves was, how can we galvanise all of those with skin in the game to get us all to take action together? And that's what this plan tries to start. The fourth reason I think we stopped to do this work was we wanted to make sure we had help to set us on the right course. We know it's a challenging area, it's a challenging disease. The therapeutics are diverse and interesting. We want to make sure at Mito Foundation that we invest our effort and our funds in a way that has the maximum impact possible, choosing the things that are going to make the biggest difference, that matter most. So what did we do? I've put a picture of Lee up on there because I thought that he'd really enjoy that.
Thanks.
So between July and December last year, we went out and started asking others for insights on what it was that needed to be done, what they thought success would look like, and how they could help us. We started looking at what was published already. So much has already been learnt in developing new disease treatments for other rare conditions, particularly metabolic conditions, as Drago talked a little bit about. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So along with the action plan today, we've published a literature review. It's pretty long, it wasn't particularly rigorous, it's not going to get published in academic literature, but it's there and it's interesting if you want to have a look at what else is happening and what we can learn from. And then we started talking to people. We started asking questions and listening. So we had 14 formal interviews and countless coffee chats and incidental chats with people. Thank you to everyone that took part in all of those discussions. We ran a survey for Mito community members, for industry organisations or sponsors of Mito clinical trials and for Mito clinicians, and more than 50 people responded to that. And we ran 2 workshops, and the photos on the screen are from the community workshop that was held at our Mito Community Summit in Melbourne last year, which had about 35 people take part. But we also had 73 people at our Aussie meeting, so health professionals and researchers and industry representatives. So we wanted to learn from all of these people. We also, in addition, talked to people that have been through this journey for other rare diseases, and particular call out to the Duchenne muscular dystrophy representatives who taught us a lot about what they've been through and gave us some great advice. And also our Mito organisation colleagues internationally, particularly those in the US. So again, a huge thank you to everyone who gave up their time to talk to us, fill out surveys, etc. The good news is that what we heard was actually quite consistent in what it is that we're aiming for. So from that, those amazing insights, we developed a bit of a vision of where we're trying to get to. So I'm just going to highlight the 3 main areas of this so we can have that shared vision as we keep making progress. So we believe that achieving this vision will support a long and rich set of clinical trials for Mito, particularly in Australia, for many years to come. The first part of that vision is a trial-ready Mito community. So it means that the Mito community needs to know about trials. They need to have clear information about trials. They need to be well supported to make decisions. As Drago has explained, and Isabel, clinical trials are an experiment, and only with really clear trial information can Mito community members in Australia make informed decisions about whether it's a good option for them. We also want to make sure that trials are being set up in a way that is actually targeting the outcomes that matter to the Mito community, because we know that those outcomes and whether they matter to the community are going to make a big impact on whether we can have these medicines accessible, whether they can be approved and funded, particularly in Australia. But also ultimately, if we're not targeting the things that matter, we're not going to make a difference to people's quality of life. The second aspect of this vision is that we have to have engaged industry and other funders. So, as Drago explained, we can have both industry-sponsored or sponsor-led clinical trials as well as those run by others. The investigator-led trials initiated by our clinicians, they need other sources of funding. So this vision is also about making sure we've got sustainable investment outside of that commercial drug development model. And that means often government and philanthropy, and sometimes in combination with industry to make things happen. Regulation, of course, is important. Patient safety, as Drago said, is at the heart of clinical trials, but we're looking for processes that are as streamlined as possible. The third aspect of the vision is around our amazing clinical research teams. I did have a giggle about the most important person being the primary investigator, and I'm glad Drago acknowledged that actually the person that makes things happen is the trial coordinators, and I know we have some listening in today, so I'm glad that was corrected. I'm joking. So it was really clear that from everything that we heard that our clinician researchers are the secret sauce of getting all of this moving, particularly here in Australia. These clinician researchers need to be in positions that give them the time to do this work. We know as patients of those clinicians that they are stretched so thin. So it's going to be up to us to support them to have the time to do this, but also the health services that employ them to value this and see this as a part of providing care to people with Mito and other rare diseases. Clinical trials have to become part of their workload, not something they have to do after hours. They need to have amazing teams around them. Our amazing clinical trial coordinators, who are often nurses, but also allied health, who might be measuring some of the outcomes, and administrative support to reduce the burden on those clinicians as much as possible. We need them to be well connected into the global Mito community so that they know about the research that's coming through and can make these decisions. We need them to be connected to each other. It's clear that this is not a task for any single centre in Australia. It's going to be a multi-centre approach that is going to make trials accessible to the Mito community. So that was our vision. That's where we want to head to. And then we said, well, there's a lot of work to get us there. Where should we start? So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the action plan itself. This is incredibly difficult to go through in the time that I have, so I can only encourage you to get online to the Mito Foundation website and have a look at the clinical trial action plan and get into the weeds. I'm going to quickly talk through these three, and that should use up my time. So the hardest part of any planning process is choosing what to focus on. It's always so tempting to try and do everything all at once, but we've picked these 3 things to focus on. We also learnt through that consultation and talking to people that many things that are already happening absolutely need to continue, including many of the things that Mito Foundation supports. So we're not starting from scratch. That's good news. First area is building clinical research capacity. So this is a little bit special in Mito because the diversity of the Mito community is also reflected in the diversity of those Mito specialists. We're not talking about one type of doctor that will be that clinical researcher. We're talking about metabolic physicians like Drago. We're talking about neurologists or neurogeneticists that often take care and the primary Mito specialists for adults living with Mito. And we're also talking about ophthalmologists for those types of Mito that often present as a vision loss. So we're not talking about just one type of clinician researcher. But we already have some amazing Mito specialists in Australia and they've already collaborated on many clinical research projects. So again, we're not starting from scratch. So some of the actions under this priority area is trying to attract new funding, including funding that Mito Foundation is looking at how we can put on the table, directly to build that clinical research capacity. As Drago mentioned, one of the challenges with industry-sponsored trials is that the money doesn't start flowing until the patients are recruited. So there's a bit of a gap in how we can fund those clinical trial coordinators and others to get the trial site ready. Is there a role for philanthropy and the local health services to fund some of that work? We know that the trials are probably going to be bumpy for the first few years. They're not going to be a regular flow of these. So how can we financially sustain these teams? New funding will possibly be required. We've also made a recommendation in the action plan that industry needs to look at different models. And I know our friends over in the US are also talking to some of our Mito medicine companies about how they can structure their funding differently. The other thing that came out under this priority area was the interdependency between getting clinical trials happening and having really good healthcare teams for Mito, independent of clinical trials. So centres of expertise is a model that's widely acknowledged in healthcare, but particularly in rare diseases. And our friends at Rare Voices Australia continue to talk to our governments about this model. We have some great Mito teams, some great metabolic teams that are providing great care, but generally they're very underfunded compared to the care that's needed. So there's a real shared value here in investing in these centres of expertise because they can improve the healthcare that's provided to the Mito community, but also be the home for clinical trials. So we'll continue in our advocacy to improve centres of expertise for Mito in Australia. The second priority area is about supporting the Mito community to participate in trials. We feel like this is our sweet spot at Mito Foundation to really lead this work. Our Mito community is diverse and not all of them are already connected to Mito specialists. Some actions here under this priority area are about working with healthcare professionals and the Mito community to increase their connections. We'll also be increasing and improving our education to the community about clinical trials, and this event is a starting point for that work as well, so that the community is ready to make decisions about trials when there is a trial available for them to consider. We also talked a lot, and this came through in the workshop in Melbourne last year with the community, that the trial experience needs to be supportive. People need to be supported before the trial, during the trial, and really importantly, after the trial. And we think that there's a lot of support and action that could be taken to make sure that's the experience of the Mito community with clinical trials in Australia. I'm going to try and speed this up. The last priority area I wanted to talk to you about was strengthening collaboration. We heard loud and clear in our consultations and our research that this is going to be a team effort. Yes, we think Mito Foundation has a role, but others do as well, and we want to make sure that we're all working collaboratively within Australia and with our international networks. There's some actions here that were suggested about where Mito Foundation could play a role, but also room for others, like the professional societies that support our clinicians that work with Mito patients, international Mito groups and others, and also our relationships with industry. So as I said, these are the 3 areas that we've chosen to focus the actions on in the action plan, but it was hard to put boundaries around them. So I'm going to quickly highlight some of the other contributing work that is still really important. Enhancing data infrastructure, the simplest thing to talk about here is patient registries. This is really complex for mitochondrial disease. There are multiple patient registries around the world and in Australia. a database of patients, some information about them is essentially the crudest definition of a registry. And Mito Foundation already operates one called the Mito Registry. And the scope of that is about supporting clinical research recruitment. So I encourage anyone who is affected by Mito and has someone in their family affected by Mito to consider joining the Mito Registry. But registries are also important to develop natural history data, which is our understanding of how a disease might progress, which is really important when we consider whether a medicine is making a difference. So there's multiple registries. At the moment, we're aiming to grow the Mito Registry so that it can do the job it does at the moment for even more people. On the top right there, we talk about what we've already touched on. We need to get our ducks in a row. We need to be having conversations with Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration about approving medicines and for our reimbursers or our funders through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. We already have great success in this space with public funding through Medicare of genomic testing for Mito, and our goal is to make sure that we are ready to make this happen as quickly as possible in Australia. The bottom left is the trickiest part for me, because a clinical trial doesn't operate in isolation. We need to have investigator-led trials as well as commercial-sponsored trials. We also need to have really good outcome measures, which Drago talked about, and also things like understanding patient-reported experience measures and outcome measures so that the patients can add the data of what it meant to them on top of sometimes crude measures like 6-minute walk tests. All of that work needs to continue, but also keeping that pipeline coming means we need to make sure that there's continued investment and focus on developing new treatment options so that these trials will continue for many years to come. And the last area of contributing work, which is the place that I feel the most comfortable, is advocating for those long-term improvements. As Nadia mentioned, there are reforms being led by the Australian government to improve clinical trials in Australia generally, not for Mito specifically, and we need to make sure that those reforms work well for the Mito community and Mito clinical trials. That includes clinical trial reforms as well as improvements to the process we call health technology assessment, which is how we decide to fund things through Medicare and the PBS. So we'll continue our advocacy work, which we know we're really good at, to make sure that those reforms happen in a way that works really well for Mito. So what happens from here? So it's a 10-year plan, as I mentioned, but we're so keen to get started. So a few things that are already underway. So we will be dedicating funds from Mito Foundation to build clinical research capacity in Australia, but we'll have to balance that with continued funding for other types of research. And we aim to share information about that new type of funding within the next 6 months. We'll also soon, I think in a couple of weeks, based on what Isabel told me, opening applications for our next round of clinical fellowships. And we'll be particularly encouraging applications that are related to building clinical research capacity in our clinical trial teams. We've also set a goal of increasing the numbers in our Mito registry from 500 to 1,000 in the next 5 years. And we'll have to work with Mito specialists around the country and directly with the Mito community to help make this happen. We're going to continue our work to support recruitment into clinical studies and trials for members of the Australian Mito community. And we'll continue our work with working directly with industry on very specific trial opportunities and connecting them to Australian clinicians to consider being site investigators. And we'll also be establishing a task force to guide the implementation of this because, as I said, it's going to be a long journey. So our door at Mito Foundation is always wide open. Please don't hesitate to get into contact with us so that you can help us in this work over the next 10 years. Thanks, Nadia.
Claire, thank you for that. Energy and enthusiasm is abundant, and coupled with a clear action plan, I think, is the bit that I keep referring to, which is about giving our community hope. Which is what they've got. And I note that the photograph we chose for the front of the report shows an empty road, but I think after that walk through, the whistle stop through the action plan, there needs to be a lot of cars on the road, because clearly there are a lot of action cars
I would
taking
argue
place.
that there should be walkers along the road, and I understand that is actually one of the roads that our Wollongong Bloody Long Walk walks along. So we should get an action shot and replace that.
I think we absolutely should, because the Mito community is small but mighty, and I think think that is, again, all part of the hope. So now is time to dig a little deeper into some of the areas that you've all put on the table. And Leah, I'm going to come back to you because I do want to get back into the clinical side of things, but at the end of the day, we can never lose sight of the people who we're doing this for. And so I guess, given your role in the Mito Community Summit last year, and you know, the sharing of thoughts on the kind of support needed, we can hypothesize as to what that might be. But hearing from you, what is it that you most need as somebody within the Mito community?
Well, we did cover this in the Mito Summit, and one of the things that was a clear message that came through was around the collaboration with clinical trials in Australia, and about having clear communication and about having it really easy to understand the pros and cons of the trials. And sorry, because I made a few notes because I saw that question come through. So
I was predictable as what you're saying.
Yes, pretty much. So there was also wanted to have some really good support through the process from a mental health perspective, and realising they do realise the challenges that the Mito community face in relation to getting more numbers in, and getting more people on the registry. So, but overall, myself and the Mito community were very, amongst all the participants in the session on that day, it was very the excitement about the reality of trials potentially coming to Australia was really real, and really, as you said, gives a bit of hope, which was great.
So one of the questions that we often hear when it comes to the idea of trials as therapy is how do you get to find out about trials? And so obviously I'm going to ask Drago and Claire to talk a little bit about that. But for you, as the person on the ground experiencing this world of information out there, how do you access it? So how do you find out about trials?
Just staying really connected with the Mito Foundation, and being on the registry. And registering, once you get a diagnosis, you register on there with what the diagnosis is and your interest as well, and that comes through. You get information fed through to you from that registry. Am I correct in saying that, Claire?
That's how it works.
Yes. Yeah. My wife and I have a close connection with the Mito Foundation, so we probably get a bit more information than what most others. But if you do register, you will get that information.
The importance of community in all of this, and staying with trials. Claire, we've got a question around the Australian Teletrial program, which supports teletrials across Australia. Is this, especially for access for rural and regional, to broaden that pool of participants? Is this something that Mito has looked at for Mito trials and that access piece?
Yeah, when we set out to define what we're aiming for, certainly this is not just about seeing the counter of Mito clinical trials going up. We actually want access to be available to as many people as possible, where they can have the choice to participate or not. And things like teletrials, which are being developed for other conditions, are certainly applicable. One of the challenges in mitochondrial disease is what are the outcomes that we're measuring, and can they be measured remotely? And there's a great project that Mito Foundation is actually part supporting, looking at a new video assessment tool. So being able to measure outcomes and the degree of kind of neuromuscular impacts of Mito by recording a video of specific movements and having a physiotherapist assess that remotely. And that would actually, change the number of times you've got to go into the clinic in a central location and have your walking or other sorts of exercise and movement observed. So those sorts of things, teletrials, multiple sites in Australia, and innovative ways of assessing outcomes, I think would all contribute to improving access. So people living in regional areas like myself are not having to move to metro areas. The other thing that complements, I think, this topic is that we heard from the Mito community, and we also heard that from some of the other similar condition communities that we talk to, patients are okay to move temporarily. What's most important for them is that they can get access. So the fact that we have, what are we at, 25%, 30% living in non-metro areas in Australia should not be a reason that we can't host trials in metro centres. So there's still patient appetite. Yes, make it as accessible as possible, reduce my clinic visits if you can, but also we just want the option. And if that means I have to travel, that's okay too.
I'm going to come back to you a little later on the equity issue and on some reimbursement. So heads up there. But Drago, I want to come to you in terms of the idea of increasing, clinical research capacity. You've got people who are thinking, well, you're a researcher, why aren't you just running, a plethora of clinical trials and getting them up and running? And you gave us a bit of an, insight into how complex it is. But what have you seen that works to get clinician researchers mobilised and active within a health services setting?
I'm just trying to reflect on my own experience, and when I started being a metabolic consultant, a trial came to me and said, "Would you be able to run it?" I then looked around. I was lucky to fall into the lap of a clinical trial team at the Royal Adelaide Hospital called Park, and they've been amazing. So they were able to support me as a new, a principal investigator for a trial, got me set up, worked with them, and they worked amazingly. If I didn't have them around at that point in time, that particular team that was well established, had run trials over and over again, I don't think I would have got that trial up and running. So I think having these really well-established clinical trial units that are adaptable and flexible, it was key for me personally. Can we replicate that across the country? I don't know. There are teams already out there that are doing trials in the neurology space, particularly in adults, muscular dystrophy and other neuromuscular diseases. I think they are a resource, they are experienced, and that we should be tapping into those teams, even though they might not traditionally look after Mito patients or have much familiarity about them. There's enough similarity between the patients they've been managing through clinical trials and the Mito population that they'll be able to pick these studies up and run with them. So this is where I think doing a body of work to find out where are all the clinical trials, established clinical trial teams, what are they doing, what are their skill sets, can they do Mito studies as well and get them on board, would be really important.
So that becomes equally important not only for those for would-be funders of trials, but also for community looking to get access. And as you said, there's registries are certainly one way of doing it, advocacy and platforms. But how expensive is it for overseas-based therapy clinical trials to set up in Australia? Do we make it easy?
Do we make it easy? Look, I mean, the problem is, when a sponsor wants to run a study, they have to have a presence in Australia. That means they have to enrol usually a CRO or someone similar to that, and that's usually the first step before they can even engage with people here in Australia. So there's always there's a kind of a little bit of a barrier there, but that's an important barrier. But in terms of, so just remind me of the question. It was about getting.
Do we make it easy for?
Do we make it easy? I think we do a good job of getting studies up and running and getting them going. I think there was another question that was on the list there about is there anything that the federal government can do to help clinical trials happen more easily? In actual fact, the process of getting a trial up and running, the biggest barrier tends to be getting your ethics application through and getting your governance approval through, and that's all local issues. If you've got a good local HREC, you've got a good local research governance unit that you work with, then that process doesn't take very long. The government, in terms of registering the trial, that's a very easy process. In terms of access to therapy at the other end, that's where I think we need to put a lot of more effort into, that once studies have been concluded, the therapy is approved, getting it funded, and we found that my experience has been that's been the biggest hurdle in getting therapy finally to patients, is getting the funding and access approved through the government, through the PBAC and those other mechanisms. Well, life-saving drugs program is the other one that we use, that's commonly used to fund these therapies.
So that's a bit of the technical aspect. I'm putting a member of community hat on and saying, well, the sorts of things, that's all well and good, but how do I get access to a clinical trial? And the age limits keeps coming up as an issue. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Look, I think it's the protocols are the protocols, unfortunately. We, as the clinical trial teams that run the protocols, generally do not have a lot of input into the way the protocols are run, how they're drawn up. There will be reasons that the companies have put those restrictions in place. Some of them are valid and really important to make sure that the data they get out is going to show what they're hoping it will show. And so, it's I think it's that I've only been fortunate enough to be involved with the discussions with a company early in that kind of design phase to be able to guide them. But a lot of times there are significant limitations on what they can and can't do. And I think one thing you do need to think about and remember is the inclusion criteria generally have to be pretty tight to be able to show a difference, particularly in small populations. So that might mean that, you know, there'll be very strict requirements on how far a person is able to walk or needs to be able to walk in order to qualify for the study. There might be some very specific laboratory results that need to be in a particular range for you to be qualified for that study, and there are good scientific reasons for that. So, but the problem is the companies have this challenge between restricting it to get the good results, so as to keeping it open enough where the results are going to suffer in a situation where there are not that many patients around the world or the country to recruit. So it's a really kind of difficult balancing act.
So, I mean, obviously, you know, Lee, you raised earlier, you know, the challenge of you know, if you get access to a trial, the fact that your hopes could be dashed. So I'd like to know from your perspective, you know, for somebody who's perhaps recently diagnosed into the Mito community, kind of what do they need to know? And that's first part of the question, because we've got to do this, make this a bit difficult. The second part of the question is how do you manage that sort of the hope side of things and the reality of it might not work?
It's a good question. I think the hope side of things, I think that has to be really clearly communicated from the start to say that this isn't a golden ticket that get you out of this. I think that's it's got to be really clear, because some people, from my experience, some people they read the information but still see the hope. They've still got more hope than what they probably should have. I think it's really hard. It's a hard balance, because you don't want to completely douse that hope either. So you want to be able to make sure you're giving them enough information that they can understand exactly what the trial's aiming to achieve, and then hopefully, it's a really tough question to answer. I don't know. I actually don't know how to answer it in a really insightful way. Sorry.
That's right. Look, managing expectation is really, really, really difficult across clinical trials. As Lee said, some people will come into it thinking this is going to cure them, and in the consent process, that's really something that we kind of focus on a lot. The consent process is really, really important for any of these clinical trials, making sure that people fully understand what the protocol looks like to start off with, what they're getting themselves in for in terms of visits and assessments, blood tests, other types of things, what the potential side effects are going to be of the therapy, and what maybe some potential benefits there might be. We don't emphasise the benefits too much because we don't know, and we can't guarantee that. Social media sometimes, you know, blows some of these studies up bigger than they're going to be, and then managing that expectation can be very, very difficult. And the other thing, as I mentioned in my talk, you know, we haven't had a lot of success in the Mito field for clinical trials. Mind you, some of the earlier ones were mostly in vitamins such as CoQ and so forth, and they haven't really kind of shown the promise that everyone was hoping at the time. And even some of the more specific targeted therapies have not really met their primary outcomes in trials. So I think from me, there's a fair bit of pessimism about trials, and I try not to get too excited with them, but still think that we need to be actually doing these and pushing the envelope wherever we can. But managing that expectation is really, really difficult. And it's very clear in that communication and in that consent process. And I emphasise the consent process, the most important part of recruiting a patient for that clinical trial, making sure they completely understand what the study can actually achieve for them.
So Lee, what gives you hope?
Things like this, that we might actually have an opportunity to be part of a clinical trial in the future. I think that's one thing, obviously, that we would be really hopeful for. That, you know, even if it helps by, we have a clinical trial and it helps by 10-15%, that's better than what we had. So we'd be forever grateful if something like that actually come through and gave it, and we had the opportunity in, like I said earlier, in our own state, in our own country, to actually participate. That's the thing that gives me a bit of hope.
Which brings us to the notion of collaboration and why that is so important and why that's been identified as a key platform or priority in the action plan. Claire.
Sure, I had so many thoughts on the previous questions, Nadia. So I think collaboration is particularly important in Australia because we are a country with a relatively sparse population. We will require multiple sites, which means multiple clinical research teams working together. We can feel like, to people outside of Australia that are not used to jumping on a plane for 20 plus hours, like we're a really, really long way away.
Yeah.
And so having those personal relationships that make them have faith that it's worth gambling on Australia, it shouldn't be a gamble, but it's all risk management, is really important. So Mito Foundation makes sure that we have a presence at mitochondrial medicine meetings so that we can have that frank conversation to say, I know Australia feels like a small country and a long way away, but we've got these other benefits. And these decisions are made based on relationships. Collaboration is also important because this is a challenge that other Mito communities around the world are facing. And the more that we can work together, whether that's on combining data to better understand the Mito community or pitching and sometimes even pitching in money to make things happen, like, for example, the Lee Syndrome Research Consortium that's underway already and running a large natural history study which includes multiple sites in Australia. Those examples of collaboration are really important because of the fact that we're a small country, a diverse population in the Mito community. And, you know, as Drago mentioned, collaboration between clinician researchers and other experts, whether they're clinical trial units, like the one at at Park in Adelaide that Drago mentioned, or whether they're the kind of mentoring team that's ahead of the road on a different rare genetic condition or a different neuromuscular condition, so we can learn as a community.
So what then, from an industry perspective, is the message? I mean, I know there are lots of messages to everybody involved in this journey, but from an industry perspective, as you say, it's not, hopping on a plane, we're a long way away and so on, but what's the message for industry in all of this?
Absolutely. So the main message is that the door is open. Australia knows how to do clinical trials well. We have a pretty good track record in other similar conditions, and we're building a good track record for Mito. We're building on a great track record for other types of clinical research for mitochondrial disease. So we're building on some real expertise in diagnosis, and we're one of the few places in the world with public funding, for example, for genomic diagnosis. And about 90% of clinical trials that have been established for Mito so far have required a genetic diagnosis. And so we think that we're going to have good numbers because we've got wider uptake of genetic testing in Australia. And so far, for many clinical research projects, but as well as some of the small number of clinical trials that we've had in Australia, we do this well. We have low patient dropout. We have engaged patients and engaged clinicians. We have a strong health system. Now, I won't go as far as to say we have proper universal health care, but we have a strong, robust healthcare system, and all of that supports clinical trials. And at a state and territory level, we have great support. There's been some great initiatives by our state governments that run our health services. They are supportive of this. So come and talk to us and come and talk to Australian clinical researchers.
That's a strong message. Drago, what steps can Mito community members take to ensure that we attract new clinical trials or we initiate clinical trials here?
I just want to just emphasise what Claire said. It's exactly what I would say as well in answering that question, but also emphasise that we have done these trials before, and we have actually been flying patients around the country for clinical trials, and it's something that actually does work, and it's relatively inexpensive when you compare it to the cost of a trial. So in terms of accessing trials, even though you might be rural or remote or you're well away from another centre, that shouldn't preclude you from being involved in a study in Australia, I think. We've been very successful in running trials like that across the country and getting people around very easily. Yeah.
You talk about being precluded from a clinical trial. As I flagged earlier, remuneration is a big deal, and we've had a couple of questions that have come in on that. Funding for participants, because they often have to go to another state for trials, especially with them being predominantly metro. I'm going to sort of progress along the line here. Lee, would that be a disincentive for you to participate, or is it a case of you move heaven and earth to do what you can?
No, I think you would move heaven and earth. It was to help improve the livelihood of one of your loved ones for sure. You would definitely do it. I'd definitely move in a state or anything if that was make things happen. Yeah.
So that brings us to the moral and ethical issues around that, and Drago, from that remuneration for participants, where does that sit in the scheme of things?
Yeah, look, I can draw upon experience of running a lot of clinical trials with interstate and even international participants, and the companies, because these trials, patients are very precious in these trials. They're few and far between, and they'll move, again, like I said, heaven and earth to get the patients to the centre to be part of the trial. And so the companies are generally very open to paying the transport fees for patients to travel, a stipend for meals and accommodation. And so we've found that most patients, when they're participating in a trial and having to travel to a different state or a different city, are generally well supported in that process. So this is why I think, people shouldn't feel like they might be precluded from being involved in a study just because of their location, because I think my personal experience and experience with other trials is that that shouldn't be an issue for them. So that's the main. So I think that's to make sure that everyone has equal and equitable access to these trials.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, from your perspective, what would be your message to the broader, to the families living with Mito as you do, as to what is it that they should know, as a piece of personal advice from you? What is it that keeps you going? Is there something that's happened on your journey that's that said this is, I wish it could be there for all those sufferers?
Yeah.
I know, tough questions today.
It's tough. I don't know. I think for us, what keeps me going. Sorry, I just hit my mic. What keeps me going is obviously it's our son. It's our only son. It's our only child.
Yeah.
Anything we can do to get him better health and better care, we'll, as we said, we move heaven and earth and try and do our best to make that happen. I think what advice, it's so hard because everyone's position is so unique and everyone's on different levels, but so it's hard to really give advice to others on what they should do.
Leaning in on the Mito community,
100%. Yeah, being heavily involved and trying to get it as involved as you can with the Mito Foundation, so you are at the forefront of the information that's coming through, and you can speak to people like Claire who can give you that information. And there's excellent people within the Mito Foundation who you can lean on and actually get that support.
Drago, you mentioned something that, once the trial comes to an end, and yes, there's the sort of the non-publication and so on, but we had a question from somebody asking about, Australian regulations for compassionate use and expanded access and open label. But let's talk a little bit about that, because that's a really key factor at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think compassionate use, early access, all of those things are kind of interchangeable terms. Yeah. Essentially what you're asking for is access to the therapy before it's been either approved or funded. And so if you're lucky to be on a clinical trial, you'll be on an extension protocol, and that will allow you to stay on drug. But some companies, and not all of them, and it's completely up to the company as to whether they'll decide to do this or not, will open up for open access. It opens them up to all sorts of risks, I think, the company. So a lot of companies don't do it and will just provide expanded access to people who have been on the trial. But some companies will open it up and allow other patients to participate. There are a couple of steps involved in trying to access expanded access. First of all, we have to get the company to say, yes, we're happy to provide it to you. Usually that doesn't come without any strings attached. The strings attached would usually be involved in providing some data back to the company on progress, so there might be a few investigations you need to do or monitor a few things. You then need to get it signed off through a special access scheme through the federal government. That's usually just a paper process. Mm-hmm. Most of the time that's not an issue. The third thing that needs to happen is that you need to have your hospital that's going to actually going to dispense the medication or dispense the therapy to approve you actually dispensing it from them, and that usually goes through a kind of drug and therapeutics committee or an ethics committee within the hospital. So it's not an easy process, but the fundamental thing is all dependent upon the company, how, and it's entirely up to them as to whether they offer one or not. and each company is different. Each company has a different philosophy around it. Some companies are very open and want everyone to access it. Remembering that they might be providing a therapy that's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars for free for a period of time, hoping that it's going to get eventually approved and funded, and then they're going to get money back for it later on. So there are financial risks, there are kind of other legal risks involved in having open access for these drugs, but essentially it comes down to the company. But processes are there for us to access those if the company allow them.
And I think goes back to the point made around, you know, the importance of collaboration, that it is large, it is complex, there are a lot of variables, and it's a costly process. But by having a Mito Foundation to be able to, and other advocates to be able to play a role in bringing the collaboration together is maybe part of the way to navigating through the complexity of the process. Drago, just a sort of towards the end of this now, do any of the clinical trials for Mito involve multiple family members? The questions come up for us.
I saw that question. Look, if multiple family members meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria, I would have no issue with having multiple family members in a trial. But they have to meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria to do that. So if it's a MELAS trial, for example, we know that the kind of generational, it's a very, you know, there can be numerous people in a family with the same mutation or other mitochondrial DNA change, that if you qualify, there should be no reason why you couldn't be in the trial with your auntie or uncle or brother
in this
or
case
sister.
It was 4 generations within a family. It was an interesting question.
If you meet the criteria, I mean, you know, it's probably best you don't kind of keep, look, I think it's it's what you tell the family members in terms of interaction, but I can't see there being any major impediments for that to occur.
In our final moments, because I am aware we're right on time now, so I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief. You've got a choice here in the difficult question category. So the heads up is a final reflection, or if you were in charge for the day. So you win the next federal election, you're in charge, what's the one thing that you do? So your choice is what's the one thing that you do, or a reflection. It's a tough question, Lee, I'm sorry, and I'm not going to come to you first because I've been throwing the tough ones at you.
That's
so,
all right.
Drago, I'm going to come to you
me
first.
All right, okay.
And then I'm going to Claire, and then I'm going to Lee. So
Yeah.
you're getting some
So I'm not
injury
going to get away
time
with
here.
little piece
No,
there.
you're
am I?
not.
No, okay, all right. So I think for me, I think, yeah, I'm being a little bit selfish here, and that properly funding clinical services to give us space and time to undertake clinical trial research without us having to do it in our own time. Many of us who run clinical trials just tack this on to our day-to-day work. That's my selfish answer, but I think, you know, being able to do that and actually still maintain our clinical service at the same time is really, really important. But although if I'm not being selfish, I think getting a really good registry across the country for Mito, so we know where all the patients are and supporting them, and supporting those clinical, you know, those clinical teams.
Spoken like a true researcher, you snuck a second one in
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
I like
okay,
it
good.
though, I like it. Okay, your 30 seconds starts now, Claire.
Sure, I was going to say exactly the same thing. It's not selfish for me. Drago's point that we need those clinical research teams, they've used up about 10 seconds, so I'm going to add a final reflection. I've only been part of the Mito community for coming up to 4 years, and this is an incredibly exciting time because we've made so much progress around diagnosis. We're making incredible progress around reproductive options, and we continue to battle on behalf of the community to make sure they've got good support for their day-to-day lives and how they're impacted by Mito. Investing in treatments and making clinical trials a reality in Australia is the fourth part of this next step as to what it means to have Mito in Australia. This is incredibly important, and I look forward to working with everyone on it.
Thank you for that, and Lee.
Yes, I'll go with a reflection. So back onto a question you asked before about what can you do to actually help. I think one thing, because we do feel a bit helpless on what we can do, we try and get heavily involved in the Bloody Long Walk and raise money. And so, because every donation, every fundraiser, every grant plays a direct role in accelerating these processes. And when people are donating and contributing to money, it's giving people like families like us a bit of hope. It's supporting the scientists, pushing the boundaries, and it's also helping ensure these ideas that scientists have get off the shelf and just purely because of a lack of funding. So anything we can do about raising money and grabbing that support to help fund this will go a long way.
And I think this is where we say nothing further, Your Honour. That was just beautifully put. What an incredible conversation. We've only scratched a little bit of the surface. Clearly a lot more to be discussed, to be said, and importantly to be done. I think you can hear the energy, the commitment, the dedication and enthusiasm of everyone involved in this journey, in particular the Mito Foundation. My thanks to you, Lee Caulfield, Dr. Drago Brakovic and Claire Stewart, of course Sean Murray and Isabel, and all of you for participating with us today, and to echo Claire's sentiments. It is a long journey, but we're in this together. Stay with us, work with us, and let's get to the point that we want to, which is no Mito. But thank you all for your time and attention today, and we look forward to the next time. Cheerio for now.
Thank you.